Any sane person would have just rolled up over the British, but when Hitler showed up on the border with France, he was making frequent laudatory public statements about the British, saying how much he respected and admired them. And everyone thought Hitler had lost his mind, everybody down to the last pair of boots on the ground. Movie cameras followed Hitler around as he walked back and forth on the other side of the border with France. And they made videos of him strolling and laughing alongside his 100 well-dressed senior commanders. And Hitler actually announced publicly that because France was now defeated, Britain would sign a peace treaty. On the 20th of May, the British waiting at Dunkirk told the French waiting for orders to return home that if they didn't start shooting at Germans, the British would start shooting at the French, and that it would look like a clear German victory when others came to pick up the pieces. The British threatened to attack again on the following day, but the French replied that the Germans wanted peace, and failing to get the French to move, the British went ahead on their own in the first naked aggression of Hitler's war, launched solely by the British using 74 tanks and 3 infantry divisions. The Germans were ordered not to fire back because Hitler knew that all the skirmishing had been just isolated incidents, that the whole operation of the march into France was supposed to be a peaceful affair, just as it had been in the Rhineland and in Austria and in Norway. The British continued to advance and fire upon Germans, so Rommel dissipated Hitler and stopped the British cold, while the British army by the coast did not come to the aid of those 3 divisions and 74 tanks being finished off by German Stuka dive bombers flying unopposed. Churchill said the battle had to look real or no one would accept a peace treaty between Britain and Germany, and that meant a lot of Frenchmen had to die. And the British threatened the French again on the 21st, but by then France was out of the war. So the British attacked the Germans by themselves, and despite being directly ordered by Hitler not to fire back, it was difficult to impress upon Germans full of meth the need to hold their fire, even though it pretty well got done. When the French general in Belgium announced that he was going home, he immediately died in a car crash and was replaced with a British-loving Anglophile on the 22nd. And the new French general ordered his men to march north to Ypres and up to Dunkirk. And Churchill said he would be flying over to Calais just as soon as some more French were sacrificed. Hitler sent Germans to Calais on the 23rd to meet with Churchill, and the British heading to Dunkirk met angry Germans fed up with being told to stand down. And then something went terribly wrong when some French patriots called the German CP, warning of a double cross, and Hitler became paranoid that it might all just be a British trick. Hitler called Churchill again and was told that Churchill was on his way over to Calais, and that was the day that the Germans occupied Boulogne, as the French were supposed to be marching north through their lines. And Hitler's troops arrived in Calais on the 23rd, and that evening the German generals called a halt to all their forces and told the French civilians that they were free to rescue their soldiers at Dunkirk. The British newspapers called it a pause and reported that the Germans did not attack because they needed to refuel and repair their tanks. On the 24th of May, Hitler went to Charleville-on-the-Meuse, 45 miles west of Bastogne, and at this point, 3,500 British had died alongside 18,000 French soldiers killed and 1,000 dead French civilians. And by the 24th, the Germans had reached the Ah Canal, 10 miles outside Dunkirk, trapping the British up north who were threatening to fire on the French. And both the French and the British soldiers at Dunkirk wondered, where was the Royal Navy and where was the RAF? Where were the German dive bombers and why weren't the Germans attacking? Tra-he, the French said, and word spread with the wind. over the water, and the warning was followed by ordinary, determined, common people with their small fishing boats who came to the rescue of their husbands and fathers and sons, despite warnings from the British Royal Navy that there were dangerous German submarines about. Regardless of the easy targets, the German Air Force stayed away from Dunkirk, while Hitler called a permanent halt to all hostilities in France. And the British newspapers and radio reported that Hitler had halted because he was afraid of counterattack, and that he did not want to jeopardize his great victory by risking a march further into France. And they reported that the Germans were not attacking because they were still resting and refueling and repairing their tanks. As June approached, the commoners in their privately owned boats had to sneak the abandoned English soldiers out from under the Royal Navy's nose, under cover of darkness and in the dead of night, and the whispers of "Trahi, Trahi, Trahi" were sharpened to a knife's edge as word went out also to the French fishing families. The news from the battlefield to the home front was faster than the telegraph, and the French fisherfolk and the English fishermen, commoners all, came in droves by sea to rescue their soldier sons, despite the threat of German U-boats. Starting on the 20th of May, the small craft began showing up at Dunkirk, and by the 26th, the British were given blanket permission to leave France, but a special British commando squad opened fire on the Belgians heading home while movie cameras rolled, creating plenty of footage of burning houses and burning people to cut and paste into a story for the newspapers. And those videos would convince the general English population that there had actually been a war, even if returning soldiers told a different story, because who could argue with the moving pictures? After all, the individual soldiers only saw part of the theater, and they would tell their tales under a cloud of suspicion for having lost France to Hitler. Despite the easy target at Dunkirk, the German Air Force stayed away and Rommel was ordered to back up 10 miles. But the British continued to advance and fire, so Rommel finally put a stop to it, as only a German army can do. But he had acted against orders, and so had Erich Hübner, and Churchill would call Dunkirk a miracle for their having survived the trap, which it was, and Hitler made it a permanent halt. The British then claimed that Hitler had halted because he wanted to use the German Air Force against the British at Dunkirk as a personal favor to Goering, rather than letting the German army take all the glory. And British movie cameras made plenty of video footage of marching troops and long lines of Belgian civilians forced to evacuate from their homes by British soldiers, warning of a German onslaught, while the British troops pointed at dummies being parachuted from the skies out of unmarked planes. Actual British dummies were being parachuted from the skies to frighten the Belgians, who were told the dummies were Germans. And in the videos, the Belgians looked pained and resentful as British soldiers directed them down the road, and as soon as the civilians were gone, the British soldiers moved into their homes and ate their food and slept in their beds. The BBC now had enough footage of burning houses and burning barns to create their story of the war, and on the 27th of May, Leopold begged the Germans to please get the British out of Belgium. And what English were left in Calais were forced to leave under sporadic fire. Hundreds of Belgians had been sacrificed, and Rommel had disobeyed Hitler to rescue the Belgians from the British commando squads because they were his brother Germanics, and something needed to be done. Any witnesses who survived with a version other than what the British movie makers were creating knew enough to keep their mouths shut, even though many individuals were simply held up against walls and shot execution style during this first terrifying week of the British invasion of Belgium. The French, too, had turned against the British, and while the remaining Brits were forced out of Calais, the newspapers in Britain were calling the action in Calais, quote, keeping escape routes open, close quote. The British SAS commando squads continued to move inland with their explosives and booby traps, melting away behind the lines wearing German uniforms, and they'd been able to fire on troops that had been ordered to Dunkirk, and on the 28th, Belgium officially surrendered, and Belgians started shooting at French commanded by de Gaulle, and after the British left from Dunkirk, there was peace again in France. The British newspapers claimed that poor weather had prevented the German Air Force from bombing the beach at Dunkirk, but by the 29th they could no longer sell this story in England, so they flew a couple captured Stukas over and strafed the evacuation point for 3 days while the movie cameras rolled. But it was suspicious because so few RAF planes had shown up to even make a pretense of challenging the British-flown Stukas, and so the British newspapers explained that it was difficult for the RAF to fly that far from England. As June dawned, certain groups of British commandos were still at large, and the story was that it was too dangerous for them to evacuate under fire, and the Royal Navy had finally showed up at Dunkirk and managed to sink a few friendly boats by accident, while British newspapers were calling the evacuation from Dunkirk a victory. The British newsreels showed movies of friendly French soldiers emerging from Belgian cellars and barns and attics where they'd been hiding, and the British movie makers also came away with plenty of photos of executed allies who knew too much, which is something nobody should ever have to see. When Hitler had gone to Charleville-Mézières on the Meuse, on the 24th of May, he'd been 10 miles away from Sedan, just 30 miles upriver from Dinant, and between the 27th of May and the 4th of June, 340,000 soldiers were taken off the beach at Dunkirk, and after the British rode home from France, the Dutch and Belgians hung swastikas from their balconies and began turning in their Jews to the eager authorities. Since few knew much about Jews, other than that they were rich and sneaky, the purging of Jew communists went smoothly enough in Belgium and Holland as the war planners back in England waited for a river of Jewish gold to be squeezed out of Europe. Paris was declared an open city on the 10th of June, and on the 13th of June, Churchill again proposed his Franco-British union that would make the King of England also the King of France. But he was again refused, and Paris fell on the 14th while the Germans politely made themselves at home in France. From Wikipedia, Battle of Abbeville Aftermath Analysis. On 4 June, the French tanks drove onto a minefield in an area thought to be held by the 51st Highland Division. The Highlanders had been moved back during the evening of 3 June and had failed to notify the French troops on the flanks. German troops followed up and planted the mines in an obvious tank avenue between woods. The next phase of the war plan began right away, and that meant kicking the French out of North Africa and out of the Mediterranean. But first they had to replace all the Lend-Lease stuff they'd had to leave behind in Belgium. And the resupply would come from America, now that the British had been bested at Dunkirk and were in danger of having to surrender to Germany. And if America allowed that to happen, Britain would be unable to make any more payments to America on their debt from the Great War. Hitler ordered Rommel to go ahead into Paris, but he was told to bypass the 4 British divisions in his way. And the French general from Syria had left for Paris on the 10th of June, and the Germans drove into Paris on the 14th of June, while Hitler and his artist friends took the tour and posed for photographs. On the 16th of June, the French general from Syria resigned, and the new appointed French leader was 84 years old. And on the 17th of June, the new leader broadcast over the radio that all Frenchmen should lay down their arms. Hitler called Churchill to ask why it was taking so much time to deliver the paperwork that would make Britain and Germany friends and put an end to the war. And instead, Hitler was given a detailed list of all the equipment the British had left behind at Dunkirk. And Hitler was told that he needed needed to do one last favor for the crown before they could be friends, and that was to go topple Stalin so the old intermarried royalty could be put back on the Tsar's throne. And Churchill made this request because he thought that Hitler wouldn't really mind. Left behind at Dunkirk were 700 tanks, 2,500 large caliber guns, 20,000 motorcycles, 40,000 trucks, and 500,000 tons of ammunition and equipment, especially radios, along with 11,000 machine guns and 1,000 anti-tank guns and 500 anti-aircraft guns. Most importantly, the French army had been put out of action, so they could no longer come to the aid of their friends in Russia. So how soon could the invasion of Russia begin? In France, there were still those 4 British divisions that Rommel had bypassed, one of which was armored. And behind the lines they could do considerable damage if Hitler weren't willing to make a deal. So on the 22nd of June in 1940, the anniversary of the signing of the armistice from the Great War in Ferdinand Foch's railway carriage at Compiègne, Hitler agreed to invade Russia 1 year from that day, and Barbarossa would commence right on schedule the following year, on the 22nd of June, while the British would help the Germans set up the Vichy government of France, because that's what friends were for. The British claimed 150,000 casualties with 27,000 killed, and the British also claimed 2 million prisoners of war were being held by the Germans, but the Germans did not know where they were and surmised that the English soldiers simply hadn't shown up for roll call. In 4 weeks, the French had lost 30 divisions, although the Germans had been involved in very little of the fighting, having been ordered to halt while the British were spearheading the conflict. And Claire Booth Luce said that France had been turned into, quote, a half-starved alien gypsy camp, close quote, while Churchill was insisting that no peace negotiations could be made until Hitler crushed Russia and brought back the old world order. They came off the trains with their bewildered faces, white faces, bloody faces, faces beaten out of human shape by the Niagaras of human tears that had flowed down them, the plain and tragic and innocent faces, quaking ill old grandparents, half-mad mothers, starving children, the young, the old, the crippled, all driven like leaves before the horrible furnace on wheels that Flanders was now. Europe in the Spring, page 246 and 7. The agreement on the 22nd was that the Vichy French could keep their navy and their colonies, and all 400,000 active French soldiers could go home as soon as France officially surrendered on the 24th of June, even though nobody was fighting anyone anyhow, except for the trouble going on around those 4 British divisions egging on their friend Colonel de Gaulle. We did not talk politics anymore, and from that day to the day I left France several weeks later to return to London, I never heard anyone really talk politics again, just the caliber of guns and numbers of men and communication lines and how to throw pontoons across rivers and the speed and range of Henkels, Messerschmitts, Defiants, Spitfires, Marines, Ferries, Hurricanes, Wellingtons. Now everyone talked war, not politics. Europe in the Spring, page 228. The French had lost 60,000 killed, with 1.5 million Frenchmen taken to Germany to be put into forced labor camps, and Britain now stood alone. The Russians had not marched on Berlin during the invasion of Poland, so the Germans had not been enticed to fight them then, but as soon as Hitler crushed Russia in Barbarossa, the British could move into the Balkans, and Hitler would be allowed to keep Czechoslovakia, and the Greater Fatherland would have enough money to pay back their debt to America from the Great War. When the Nazis had marched into France in May of 1940, the Germans thought the war was over, and Hitler had ordered the demobilization of most of the German army, sending them all out on liberty, while the British army had remained on high alert, especially those 4 divisions sitting in France. As soon as the Barbarossa Agreement was made, Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to sink the French fleet parked in Algeria in North Africa on the 3rd of July in 1940, killing 1,300 French sailors, even though the French had written orders to sail to America if the Germans tried to seize the fleet. During Operation Torch in 1942, the Vichy French would sink what was left of their fleet at Marseille on the 27th of November to keep it out of the hands of the British. And Charles de Gaulle was very upset because he wanted the ships to be turned over to Britain, not scuttled. And it was a heartbreaking day as the French destroyed 77 ships, including 3 battleships, 7 cruisers, 15 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 6 sloops, 9 patrol boats, 20 auxiliary ships, 28 tugs, and 12 submarines. The British had bombed the Italian fleet at Taranto in November of 1940, the week after FDR was elected to his 3rd term. And they used 21 Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers launched from an aircraft carrier, and 2 months later, German dive bombers hit the British carrier, but it would be repaired. The sinking of the Italian fleet had been planned for the anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October, but a fire on board the carrier caused the attack to be postponed until the 11th of November, and Armistice Day was as much of a statement as Trafalgar would have been. To fight the French Napoleon, Britain had formed the first coalition in 1792 that ended with the French in control of Italy and Belgium. And then the second coalition had included Russia fighting with Britain against Napoleon. And when Napoleon went to Egypt in 1798 and found the Rosetta Stone, the British sank almost all of the French ships on the 1st of August, including 11 ships of the line. And with France weakened, the Russians drove all Napoleon's French out of Italy's Po Valley, where the lovely port of Trieste graced its northern edge. Even though the Russians were allies with Britain for the second coalition, the British began boarding and searching Russian ships, so the Russians withdrew from the second coalition in 1799, something for which the British never forgave them, blaming Russia for Britain having to fight Napoleon for another 16 years. Napoleon's revolutionary France had declared war on the Holy Roman Empire on the 20th of April in 1792, and the first coalition that Britain drummed up against the French included Austria, Sweden, Portugal, Naples, and some German barons and dukes, and the Ottomans threw in with the British. Together, these could not stop Napoleon, and in the second coalition, Napoleon fought these same players without Sweden this time. And when Napoleon was severely set back by the yellow fever in Haiti, he signed the peace treaty at Amiens with the British in 1802, but it would only last 1 year, and the Peace of Amiens would be broken by Britain's refusal to leave Malta at the request of the Russians. The first coalition had ended on the 18th of October in 1797. And the second coalition started up the following year. And the French beat the Austrians at the Battle of Hohenlinden, and the Austrians sued for peace on Christmas Day in 1800. As a result of the Battle of Hohenlinden, Napoleon wanted to be recognized as the new Holy Roman Emperor, but instead he signed the Treaty of Luneville on the 9th of February in 1801, and that treaty gave Trieste to Austria, so in future they would stay out of the war. The British were still at war with the French, even though all the coalition partners had made peace with Napoleon, and the treaty at the end of the second coalition gave Napoleon the ability to sail over to conquer America. But instead his soldiers got sick in Haiti, and he sold Louisiana to Jefferson, who used British banks to finance the purchase. Napoleon sold Louisiana on the 30th of April in 1803, the same day Hitler would die. And the weird thing about the Treaty of Luneville was that the Austrians would be brought back into the Napoleonic Wars for the third coalition, due to the dispute over Salzburg and Berchtesgaden. The Third Coalition would have the same players with Sweden brought back in, and Bavaria staying out. And during the Third Coalition, Britain was also fighting in Portugal and Spain that was called the Peninsular Campaign. And right before the Third Coalition ended at the Battle of Austerlitz, Admiral Nelson sank the French fleet at Trafalgar on the 21st of October in 1805. Nelson's 27 British ships of the line sank 33 French and Spanish ships without losing one single British vessel, but Nelson paid for the victory with his life, dying aboard his ship, the HMS Victory. The Third Coalition would end in a victory for the French at Austerlitz that began 6 weeks later on the 2nd of December in 1805, and that would put an end to the Holy Roman Empire with the signing of the Treaty of Pressburg. And Austerlitz was where Napoleon used his famous tactic of feigning weakness on his right flank, enticing the Austrians to attack, and then plugging the gap with forces brought up from the south. And as a result of that battle, Austria lost Trieste, and Britain won Hanover. Britain would also benefit from the Napoleonic Wars by winning the island of Malta in the Mediterranean that was 8 miles wide and 17 miles long, and Malta was 60 miles south of Sicily and 200 miles away from the coast of North Africa. And the Royal Navy would use the island as a storage depot and a marshalling yard. The Holy Roman Emperor had kicked the invading Muslims off the island of Malta during the Crusades, and Malta was supposed to be the island upon which St. Paul had been shipwrecked on his way to Rome. And the Tsar of Russia was the honorary head of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem that had been in charge of Malta since 1530. And after the Russians had abandoned the British during the Second Coalition, the Tsar's insistence that Britain leave Malta went unheeded. In 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor had given Malta to the Knights of St. John, who in return had agreed to bring the Holy Roman Emperor one Maltese peregrine falcon every year, and they did that until Napoleon conquered Malta on his way to shoot off the nose of the Sphinx with a cannon. When Napoleon had arrived in Malta in June of 1798, the Grand Master had not welcomed him, allowing only 2 ships into the harbor at one time, so Napoleon made himself at home anyway, and most of the Knights of Malta fled to Russia while the Grand Master moved to Trieste. Napoleon freed the slaves on Malta and set up schools and courts of law. And when Napoleon sailed away from Malta a few weeks later so he could invite the Egyptians to join the revolution, he took the treasure of the Knights of the Order of St. John with him, a hoard of gold and silver worth 6 million francs. When Nelson's fleet sunk Napoleon's ships on the 1st of August in 1798 in Egypt at the Battle of the Nile, the treasure went to the bottom of Abu Qir Bay, and History Anonymous says it's still there. Napoleon had left behind 3,000 French soldiers on Malta, as well as dozens of administrators, and when the British showed up 6 weeks after the Battle of the Nile to besiege the island of Malta for 2 long years, the French finally surrendered in September of 1800 and were allowed to go back home to Marseille. The British stayed on the island and would end up owning Malta at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the British minimized Russia's influence over the Knights of Malta, but Catherine the Great had sent many naval officers from Russia to train with them, and she had frequent contact with the Knights because Russia had played such a large role during the Crusades, and many Orthodox Catholics were left behind in Turkey after the Orthodox Pope moved up to Moscow in 1325. The Imperial Russian Navy enjoyed sailing from the Black Sea through the Strait of Constantinople to visit the Knights of St. John on Malta, and for 1,000 years after the Emperor Constantine had made Christianity the law of all Roman lands, Constantinople had been the center of the Eastern Orthodox Church, with the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia at its heart, and Hagia Sophia meant holy wisdom. As the centuries passed, the Eastern Church and the Church in Rome grew ever farther apart, so that during the Crusades the Western Knights caused trouble for the Eastern Orthodox Christians, who seemed too foreign compared to their own Western Roman traditions, especially when it came to iconoclasm and iconography. The Apostle Andrew was supposed to have traveled up the northern coast of the Black Sea to Kiev, and there he founded the church in the Ukraine that would convert Vladimir the Great in the year 988, after Christianity had been brought to the Kievan Rus. As the Russians embraced the Orthodox Church, they never lost contact with their mother religion in Constantinople, and the old believers would mourn as deeply as Jews mourned for their own lost temple when Constantinople was overrun by Muslims. When the Reds took over Russia in 1917, the Orthodox Church sided with the Whites because the Tsar was the head of the church, a monarch appointed by God, and the communists needed to cut the church down to size so it wouldn't compete with the new government of Soviets. And it would not be until another Vladimir appeared to bring the churches and monasteries back to life in all their glory, and he would rebuild them even better than before. As missionaries had carried Eastern Christianity up the Danube River through Bulgaria and Romania into Bosnia and Serbia, and as far as the Danube would take them up into Slovakia, and then as far north as Estonia, they left behind in their wake countless Eastern Orthodox churches in Greece and throughout the Balkans. The Orthodox churches got along better with Muslims than the Roman Catholics for reasons unknown, and Orthodox churches were better able to shelter Orthodox Catholics, Christians, under Muslim occupation than Western Catholicism. The Roman Catholics were also hit hard by the Protestant Reformation that didn't put a dent in Orthodox Christianity, especially in the Balkans. There had been, even in medieval times, a strong quality of messianism in Russian political theories. The Grand Dukes of Moscow had frequently pictured themselves as the heirs of Byzantium and their capital as another Rome. What more natural consequence of these theories than that Imperial Russia proclaim itself the champion of the Balkan Christian peoples, especially of the Russians, brother Slavs within the Turkish Empire? In the process, the Russians reasoned they might also gain a long-desired strategic warm water outlet on the Bosphorus and, in Montenegro, a window on the Adriatic as well. The Balkans by Edmund Stillman and the editors of Life, New York, Life World Library, Time Incorporated, 1964, page 46. The Russian victory at Kursk in July of 1943 stopped the British from achieving their Balkan dreams, so there would be no train from Constantinople to Hanover without being stopped in Yugoslavia by Russian customs inspectors dressed in Russian army uniforms. On the 30th of October in 1941, FDR had approved $1 billion in Lend-Lease supplies to Russia, and the following day the destroyer USS Reuben James was torpedoed by U-552 near Iceland, killing more than 100 U.S. Navy sailors, the first loss of an American quote-unquote neutral warship. 2 weeks later, on the 12th of November in 1941, temperatures around Moscow dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Soviet Union launched ski troops for the first time against the freezing German forces near the city of Moscow, while the Germans started a new offensive against them as the muddy ground froze again. 12 days after the Battle of Moscow, the U.S. granted Lend-Lease to the Free French on the 24th of November in 1941, and 2 days later, on the 26th of November, a Japanese attack fleet of 33 warships and accompanying auxiliary craft, along with 6 aircraft carriers, sailed from northern Japan for the Hawaiian Islands. 2 days later, on the 28th of November, German panzers were on the outskirts of Moscow. And 1 week later, on the 4th of December in 1941, the temperature on the Moscow front fell to 31 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and all German attacks were failing in what would turn out to be the coldest European winter of the century. The Germans called off the attack on Moscow on the 5th of December in 1941, even though they were now only 11 miles away, and the Russians counterattacked during a heavy blizzard. The following summer, in the hot burning sands of North Africa, Rommel seized Tobruk on the 21st of June in 1942, and Tobruk was the key to both Libya and Egypt, and 33,000 British surrendered without a fight, giving up 2,000 vehicles, 2,000 tons of fuel, and 5,000 tons of rations to the Germans, along with a very large number of tanks and 800,000 rounds of artillery ammunition and 13 million rounds of small arms ammo. 4 months earlier in Singapore, 130,000 British had surrendered to the Japanese on the 15th of February in 1942, and Churchill was in Washington, D.C. on that fatidic day when Tobruk fell. But instead of agreeing to a British capitulation in the face of hopeless inevitability, FDR brushed aside Churchill's boozy argument that if Hitler cut a deal with Churchill right away, the British and the Germans could join together to defeat both Russia and Japan. And instead, FDR told Churchill that the Americans would be landing in North Africa in 4 months, and Rommel went home to get yelled at by Hitler. The British general in charge of the fall of Tobruk was promoted and then immediately shot down by the Germans on the 7th of August after he commandeered a Red Cross plane to go on R&R in Cairo, although some versions said that he was on his way from Cairo to take up his new post, and the dead general named William Gott had been taking orders from Auchinleck, who had told Gott that orders from Cairo had been to not hold Tobruk. After the plane crash, Monty was put in as Gott's replacement to lead the 8th Army, and Churchill delivered Monty in person to North Africa, while Auchinleck was sent off to India to train new troops. The British were using Malta as a personnel base and a supply yard, and Rommel had planned to invade Malta right after the fall of Tobruk in what he was calling Operation Hercules. But Hitler ordered Rommel to stand down from the attack on Malta. After Gott died in the plane crash and Churchill personally dropped Monty off on the 13th of August in 1942, while Churchill was on his way from Cairo to visit Stalin, Churchill appointed only generals who would take orders directly from him so Churchill could run the war by himself without any outside interference. The question remained why Gott hadn't been able to open the door when his plane caught fire, since, according to Wikipedia, quote, with both engines out, the pilot had made a successful crash landing, but 2 German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters attacked the crashed plane, strafing it until the Bombay was totally wrecked, close quote. The Germans were within 60 miles of Alexandria, and the first thing Monty did at his new headquarters was to burn all the embassy papers. Stalin had betrayed the Communist Party by going nationalist and making a non-aggression treaty with Hitler, and Stalin thought the British and the French would conquer Germany soon after the war was declared, but the Allies didn't move, and the phony war ensued, and Stalin was most surprised when the Germans invaded with Barbarossa, because Stalin knew that Hitler wasn't that stupid. In April of 1944, the German architect of the non-aggression pact with Stalin, Joachim von Ribbentrop, was the ambassador to Britain, and he, quote, met with 2 British officials in a seacoast town in the Pyrenees, close quote, to find out the conditions of a separate peace with Germany. Von Ribbentrop had been born in Wiesel, where his father was an important army officer, and as a boy, von Ribbentrop had learned both French and English. And when he was 16 years old, his family had moved to Arosa, Switzerland. It was to Arosa that Hassel, the fired ambassador to Rome, went in February of 1940 to meet with the anti-Hitler conspirators. And at that time, von Ribbentrop was 46 years old and had been the ambassador to Britain for almost 4 years. Von Ribbentrop had earned the Iron Cross during the Great War, and he served as a staff officer in Turkey in 1918, where he'd gotten to know von Papen. And in 1939, Hitler would appoint von Papen as the ambassador to Turkey. Von Ribbentrop was one of Hitler's closest and dearest friends because von Ribbentrop would travel frequently to England and return with assurances that Britain wanted to make an alliance with Germany. And von Ribbentrop's hook with the British was that he believed in a restoration of the German monarchy as an intrinsic part of the Nazi plan. Von Papen was a hardcore aristocrat, and von Ribbentrop had been drawn to him for that, and in the spring of 1914, von Papen had been running guns to Huerta during the Mexican Revolution, and then he became the German military attaché to the U.S., and when von Papen began talking to the American OSS in the fall of 1943, FDR got wind of it and ordered the OSS to stop making contact with von Papen. Von Ribbentrop would be at Hitler's birthday party in the Führer bunker in April of 1945, and he returned 3 days later but was refused admittance. And von Ribbentrop would be arrested by the British near Hamburg on the 14th of June and sent to Nuremberg for trial, and he would be the first to be hanged. Von Ribbentrop loved Hitler to his dying day, and his last words were, "I wish peace to the world." And many of these side plots between the British spies and proselytizing Nazis had simply been an attempt by the British to keep their greatest fear at bay, and that was an alliance between Germany and Russia. While the great fear of every American statesman, and the reason FDR strove for friendship with Uncle Joe, had been the nightmare of an alliance between Germany and Britain. The Valkyrie conspirators involved in the 20th of July plot had asked Donovan's OSS for assistance, but FDR refused to allow any Americans to get mixed up with the Valkyrie group because they were anti-Russia. And it would have been a near thing if the OSS had managed to remove FDR. Stalin had gone to Jesuit boarding school and hated it, and FDR convinced him to rehabilitate churches anyway. Lenin had made peace with Germany by ceding most of Russia's good land and working factories, and Lenin had moved his capital to Moscow from St. Petersburg, and during the Great War, Russians had thought the German Tsarina Alexandra was sending secret messages from the Winter Palace to Germany over the new wireless transmitter. Rasputin had gotten Alexandra's only son to stop bleeding from his hemophilia, and Alexandra kept Rasputin close to her in case the boy had another episode, and Rasputin worked with the Tsarina to build roads to improve food distribution and did other public works projects, making many jealous to the point of hatred because his work deprived them of the opportunity. These officials had been keeping their positions precisely by doing nothing and making sure that nothing got done, because that would make it glaringly obvious that they were needed. Most of all, Rasputin was hated for helping Jews after he had a law passed allowing Jews into high schools for the first time in Russian history. The nobility believed that peasants and Jews were ordained to suffer by heavenly law, and when Russia was forced to retreat from Warsaw in the fall of 1915, as the Germans were marching in, the Russian army punished all the Jews they could find on their way out of Poland, believing them to be not only on the side of the Germans, but acting as spies. When the Russian soldiers came home early from the trenches, they killed all their landlords who had caused the war, and everyone starved because the managers were killed right alongside the landlords. And then the Red soldiers came through, confiscating grain and livestock for the war effort against the Whites. And the civil war that raged after the Russian Revolution dragged on year after year because the British White Army had invaded the motherland and were determined to put an end to Lenin's communists. Many of the original Soviet leaders just happened to be Jewish, although it was really more like 80%. And after gathering all the food they could from the Russian peasants, the Red Army also took their seed grain and their breeding stock, so the peasants mixed dirt in with their seeds to keep the Red Army from taking all of it, but the soldiers carried away the seed grain too. More people died of starvation in Russia in the 1920s than would be killed by Hitler in combat in the 1940s. And few books were written about Russia that accurately told what the revolution was like, because most books were written, published, and printed by people who had lost money when the Reds took over. However, a genre of Russian revolutionary novels emerged under Stalin that remain some of the best thought opera reading ever, if you can find it. The Russians tried the same thing as in Germany, putting people into work camps after confiscating their assets. But it didn't work in Russia because everyone was so poor that the government could barely break even just trying to feed them. When prisoners would fall down dead on the march to the Gulag camps, the guards would arrest some new people along the way just to make the numbers right. And after seizing all the estates from the upper classes in Russia, the revolutionaries were surprised to find out that rich people didn't actually have much wealth to confiscate after all. A man named Slavomir in Poland was sentenced as a spy because he could speak Russian, and he was sent to Siberia for 25 years, and it took 3 weeks by train and by truck for the Russians to bring Slavomir and the other prisoners to Siberia. The stopping places all looked alike, stretches of bleak, snow-covered country, sometimes wooded and sometimes not. They varied only in the degree of cold they offered. The further east we went, the lower became the temperature. The Long Walk, page 44. I worked in a felling team, handling one end of a heavy cross-cut two-man saw. Occasionally I was able to get some variation by lopping with an axe at the branches of the trees. Since the days of my boyhood on the estate at Pinsk, I had always been handy with an axe, and I enjoyed the work. I found my strength coming back daily. I became absorbed in the bustle and activity. There was a glow of pride and satisfaction in being able to use my hands again. I was allocated a bunk in one of the last half-dozen to be completed, and I well remember the wonderful feeling of shelter and warmth, protection and comfort I felt the first night I came in out of the chilling night into my new home. The air smelt deliciously of fresh-cut pine. 3 square sheet-iron stoves, equally spaced out down the length of the room, blazed red into the gloom, fueled by short pieces of sawn log, of which a supply was brought in daily by the forest working parties. We had brought in as much moss as we could carry in our fafikas to spread onto the hard boards of our beds. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the scent of pine. I lay on my top bunk, hands clasped behind my head, and listened to the talk of the men around me. The Long Walk, page 74 and 5. This little man with his little shop in Belyoysk, Belyostock, realized on his stock and bought diamonds. So his preparations made, he set out to flee Poland. Where was he going? Why, to Germany. Because, he said, he did not trust the Russians. But I argued, the Germans would have killed you. They hate Jews. Maybe, he answered. But at least I was right about distrusting the Russians. Look at me now. Perhaps it was well for him that he never was given the chance to test the Germans. The Russians caught him trying to cross the border, and that meant an almost automatic sentence of 10 years. Trying to escape from your liberators can be regarded as very antisocial behavior. The Long Walk, page 44. The prisoners were given an adequate tobacco ration, and there were 200 books in the Gulag library. And there was a priest among the prisoners who was allowed to give church services, and the prisoners were asked if they could make skis for the Russian army, and were able to make 160 pairs a day. Political meetings were held for the Russian soldiers every Wednesday night, and the prisoners were encouraged to come. Working all day in the warmth of the ski shop, with the big stove roaring all day for the steaming of the wood, I felt I was getting back towards my full strength again. It should have made me resigned to my sentence, but instead it turned my thoughts more and more to escape. The Long Walk, page 82. Slavomir was arrested in 1939, the same year that Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath was published. And when Napoleon had marched into Russia for the Battle of Borodino in 1812, over 80,000 soldiers were killed, captured, or wounded in one day, more French than Russians. And when Napoleon had gotten to Moscow one week later, the town had burned down around him, and then it started to snow. 500,000 French had marched into Russia before winter had gotten underway, and in the spring only 50,000 French were left alive. And Napoleon had taken his army into Russia to convince the Tsar to stop doing business with Britain. The fourth attempt to stop Napoleon in 1806 saw Russia, Prussia, Saxony, and Sweden allied with Britain, and the motive for the British was to kick the French out of Hanover. So Britain had blockaded all the ports from Brest on the western side of France, all along the coast of Europe up to the Elbe River, 60 miles south of Denmark. Napoleon issued his Berlin Decree, forbidding all Frenchmen from doing any business with England, and he arrested English sailors found in any port in Europe, and he seized their cargo for France. Napoleon had hoped the Berlin Decree would bring Britain back to the treaty table, but the result was a doubling down of the French sacred tradition of smuggling goods and engaging in unsupervised trade. Prussia found out that Napoleon was going to give Hanover to Britain, so Prussia declared war on France in the fall of 1806, and Napoleon marched towards the east to face the Prussians and rolled right over them, reaching Berlin within 3 weeks, and Napoleon marched another 300 miles to Kaliningrad and beat the Russian army at Friedland on the 14th of June in 1807, and the Tsar sued for peace. This fourth coalition ended with the Treaty of Tilsit, that saw Russia joining in the continental system of Napoleon's government, and at this point, revolutionary France was at the height of its power. Britain would collect a fifth coalition in 1809, made up mostly of Austria, who lost again to Napoleon's well-trained Grand Army, and as a result, Austria lost Salzburg and Trieste to the French, and Napoleon was allowed to marry the Austrian Emperor's daughter Marie-Louise, who was 18 years old when Napoleon had reached the age of 40. By the Fifth Coalition, there were too many foreigners conscripted into the Grand Army for it to be the cohesive fighting force it had once been. And the Peninsular War was draining the French, so when Britain went for a sixth coalition in 1813, they were operating under the assumption that the Germans were chafing under French rule and would rise up against Napoleon, but that's what they thought during the Fifth Coalition. Not only had the Germans refrained from rising up to interfere with Napoleon's crusade, but the British were supposed to have landed in the Scheldt to help Austria during the Fifth Coalition, but they'd been too late because by then the Austrians had been defeated in Bavaria, and when the British arrived in Holland, 4,000 British soldiers were immediately felled by swamp disease. Britain's Sixth Coalition convinced Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and some German states to fight Napoleon and his few remaining allies, and the French were finally defeated at the Battle of Nations from the 16th to the 19th of October in 1813, and the French retreated back towards their homeland. Napoleon abdicated on the 4th or the 6th of April, and he signed a first surrender on the 11th and the 13th of April in 1814, and Napoleon was sent to the island of Elba on the 30th of May, but he escaped and came back for another round, so the 7th Coalition finally forced him to quit for good, and Napoleon's last campaign was called the 100 Days. The Congress of Vienna met from November of 1814 to June of 1815, so they could undo what Napoleon had done to the thrones of Europe. And when he escaped from Elba on the 26th of February in 1815, while the Congress of Vienna had been meeting for over 4 months, Napoleon marched for 100 days until defeated one last time on the battlefield at Waterloo on the 18th of June in 1815, and he abdicated on the 22nd of June and was banished to the island of St. Helena, where he would die 6 years later in 1821 at the age of 51. St. Helena was a British possession and was an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 10 miles long and 6 miles wide, halfway between the African Congo and the jungles of Brazil. While the island of Elba had been an Italian paradise for Napoleon, where he was surrounded by his Sicilian relatives, and Elba was 7 miles off the coast of the western top of Italy's boot and 150 miles across the water from the French Riviera. Hitler spent about as much time in prison as Napoleon had spent on the island of Elba. And at the Congress of Vienna, Britain blamed America for not letting them make the King of England also the King of France, and they refused to sign the final agreement of the Congress of Vienna, claiming they had to fight Moorish pirates in the Mediterranean. America was finally free from England after the Congress of Vienna, that had seen a meeting of Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, and England. And all these wanted to get back to the good old days before Napoleon, to put the nobility back in charge and forget all about revolutionary France. And Austria was given back her territories of Salzburg and Trieste, and Russia was given most of Poland. The Congress of Vienna had already been meeting at Chimay since the spring of 1814, and after the Battle of the Nations, they moved their conference to Vienna, which was just as pleasant a location, if not more. And the Napoleonic Wars to stop the French from rolling over Europe all the way to Moscow had cost the British 9 times what they had spent to fight the Americans 32 years earlier. The good that came out of the Napoleonic Wars was that America had been left alone enough to begin to get its house in order, and what trouble the British managed to stir up in North America while Britain was busy chasing Napoleon served to firmly unite the American states in a common cause for national security. While Napoleon was getting ready on the 24th of June to march into Russia for the Battle of Borodino on the 7th of September in 1812, the British landed troops in Turkey in May of 1812 by telling the Turks that the Russians were on the way, and that set up the Crimean War in 1853, when Russia was told that Britain was taking over Turkey again, and Russia sent troops to stop them, especially because the British had landed in Turkey to fight the French. Russia wanted Serbia in order to have some access to the Mediterranean in case Britain shut off the Strait of Constantinople, and the British Crown needed to rein in the British East India Company, who had become more powerful than the Crown's own army, thanks to the lucrative opium trade. And the British Army had finally grown strong enough in 1853 to override the private BEIC militias because Napoleon was no longer a threat. The Crimean War would allow the British Crown to become the sovereign of India after ending the British East India Company's reign, after which the increased cost of sending soldiers to India would force the Crown to raise the price of opium, and that meant cutting down the oversupply, which meant Turkey, who was the second largest grower after India, and the fact remained that Turkey had a better product. In the decade before the Crimean War, railroad building had boomed into a mania, And by the time Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II went to French Morocco with a warship in 1911 to help the French keep the British out of the port of Agadir in French North Africa, the new railroad trains allowed the rich children of the nobility to amuse themselves by gambling aboard the trains, going easily from Italy to France to Germany and all the way to Russia, from one card game to another, in comfort and in style. The trains had special cars specifically for the gamblers that were full of velvet and mirrors and silver and fine furniture, and Franz Ferdinand had been getting his gambling money from his wife's Russian friends, who were trying to curry favor with the future Emperor of Austria over Serbia, where many Russians lived, and Franz Ferdinand's Austrian father would turn his gambling debts into an international incident. The Austrians were blaming the Tsar's family for loaning money to Franz Ferdinand so he could lose it over gaming tables, and while there was no way to know who was loaning him that money, he certainly wasn't getting it from his strict Austrian family with their behind-closed-doors claim to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on the 28th of June in 1914, Austria tried to blame the Russians for conscripting the Serbians to kill the heir to the Austrian throne, but it could have been anyone to whom he owed money, and History Anonymous isn't telling. A French intermediary may offer some clues because a Frenchman was supposed to be carrying messages between the Austrian emperor and the Russian Tsar, but the message had gotten garbled and arrived a day too late, after the orders to mobilize for war had already been sent out. The German Secretary of State von Jagow did not believe that Russia would declare war because it was just a small dispute between Vienna and St. Petersburg, but someone had to take the blame for the murdering of Franz Ferdinand over his gambling debts, and Serbia was a ready scapegoat. Von Jagow said during the July crisis that if Austria wanted Germany to join with them in a war against Russia, he would not, quote, jib at the post, close quote, which was a horse racing term used when a horse balks before leaving the gate. And the president of France had been at Longchamp's racetrack when he'd received news of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Mr. Viviani had just been appointed the Prime Minister of France on the 13th of June and was now in charge of the military budget of $360 million. And the French President and Viviani left for St. Petersburg on the 15th of July and arrived on the 20th of July, and they agreed with the Tsar that they would support his opposing Austria trying to take over Serbia in the wake of Franz Ferdinand's assassination. And von Jagow had thought the Tsar was bluffing about actually going to war to defend Serbia. Viviani and the French president left Russia 3 days later on the 23rd of July, and they would arrive back in Paris on the 30th, and that day Viviani sent a telegram to the Tsar that Russia should not mobilize or do anything to provoke Germany, and the following day France mobilized, and Germany threatened to march into France if they didn't immediately end their support for Russia. The Austrians had sent a cablegram to Serbia on the 23rd of July that was called a démarche, and the message was transmitted just as soon as the French had sailed away from St. Petersburg. And the Austrians gave Serbia 24 hours to respond to a long list of demands that would completely squash any Russian friendship within Serbia, including letting Austrian police enforce the law. The Tsar told the Serbians to go ahead and cooperate with the Austrians, and the Serbians sent a cable back agreeing to Austria's outrageous demands. And when the Austrians continued to agitate for war, the British intervened with an offer of mediation between Russia, Austria, France, and Germany. But von Jagow sabotaged the offer from Britain by waiting another 48 hours to deliver the British offer of negotiation. Another version of the story was that the French president and Viviani were out to sea aboard the battleship France on their way back from seeing the Tsar, and the Germans jammed the radio message between Paris and the brand new French dreadnought France that had the president and Viviani aboard, although it was possible that the ship's signal communications equipment had not yet been installed because the battleship was still in its fitting out stage, which would not be completed until August, and Viviani and the French president had been irrepressibly eager to take their new warship on a cruise through the Baltic Sea to visit the Tsar. Germany was eager to try out all their new Krupp guns that would open up new markets for their advanced weapons after winning the war, which surely shouldn't take too long, but it may have been that the Austrian emperor was simply too house poor to cover Franz Ferdinand's gambling debts, and Austria declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July while the dominoes predictably fell all the way across Europe. Britain had thrown in because they thought that if the crown threatened to come in on Russia's side, the Austrian emperor would reconsider his demands, but it was not to be. And the final nail in the coffin that guaranteed Britain joining the Great War was when the German chancellor, who was the primary agent pushing for war with Russia, offered to make a military alliance with Turkey on the 28th, and the German chancellor had been in charge of the planning of the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad. The German chancellor was an expert on everything having to do with the railways in Europe, so he would have known intimately about the gambling on the trains, and during the July crisis, he was at the forefront of wanting to punish the Russians for having given Franz Ferdinand the money to gamble himself into such crushing debt. All those with insider knowledge were determined to blame Russia for the onset of the war, and Austria was insisting that Serbia take the blame for Franz Ferdinand's death, and the German-Turkish alliance was signed on the 30th of July, and full Russian mobilization began the next day. The Germans sent a telegram to Viviani saying that if Russia didn't stop mobilizing, Germany would attack France, and the French mobilized on the 1st of August, and that evening the Germans marched into Luxembourg after declaring war on Russia. Perhaps it cannot be known whether Franz Ferdinand's father knew, or he chose to believe, or perhaps didn't know, whether or not Serbia had been behind the assassination, but the Austrian emperor had signed an order of mobilization against Serbia on the 25th of July, and the Tsar had put the Russian army on alert that same day. The Tsar was a God-fearing man and didn't think it was fair to blame Serbia for the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, and many diplomats had demanded that Austria publish their findings from investigations into the murder of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, but the Austrians had nothing more than circumstantial evidence along with wishful thinking, and the people who knew were keeping silent and remaining anonymous. The person who shot Franz Ferdinand was 20 years old and had come from a very poor village, and he'd gone to Belgrade to go to school, and 4 of his school friends with him, who could be also blamed for the assassination, were sentenced to death by hanging, but 3 of them were under the legal age for execution, so they were sentenced to 20 years in solitary confinement. The young men were taken to Theresienstadt and kept in a basement dungeon with 22 pounds of iron shackles each, and the one who'd killed Franz Ferdinand would die of TB in April of 1918 after losing his arm to the disease, and 7 months later the Great War would be over. Before the Great War, everyone had taken the whole nobility thing really seriously, and all that would be lost as it slipped beneath the surface of the mud in Flanders fields, and the word noble would become synonymous with madness. The Kaiser and the Tsar and the Emperor of Austria were gone, but the British kept their nobility just barely alive on life support after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand had brought such misery to the world. The British school system did not allow the children of the lower classes into their institutions of higher learning because if they were allowed to get ahead, the remainder of the lower classes would, quote, eventually, goaded by the constant reminders of their inferiority, rise in angry revolt, close quote. Anatomy of Britain, page 186. We can't help you, they say, because you weren't born into it. The lower classes must accept their fate as unchangeable because privilege is based on birth into an upper-class family who see this as fair. Ibid. Because parents could not pick the brightest of their progeny to inherit the title and land, aristocracies fell victim to regression to the mean. Children of parents with above-average IQs tend to have lower IQs than their parents, and their children's IQs are lower still. Over the course of a few generations, the average intelligence in an aristocratic family fell towards the population average. The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life by Richard J. Herrnstein and Charles Murray, New York, Free Press paperbacks, Simon & Schuster, Inc., 1994-1996, page 26. In the case of interpersonal and interpersonal skills, conventional intelligence may play some role, and to the extent that other human qualities matter, words like sensitivity, charm, persuasiveness, insight, the list could go on, have accumulated over the centuries to describe them. We lose precision by using the word intelligence to cover them all. The Bell Curve, page 20. As Germans were the leaders in science at the time, the miracle of Goering's daughter led others to have their sperm frozen, including Hitler and Goebbels, which is why Hitler never bothered to have any children, and Goebbels didn't mind murdering his own kids, because both of them knew that countless offspring would be forthcoming in the future. And some of the sperm receptacles were taken by submarine to Antarctica for safekeeping, and while the British sent expeditions to find it, they never did. The education system in America took a different tack. As a Vermont representative came up with the Morrill Act in 1862 that gave each state 30,000 acres of land for every senator and representative, and the land was intended to be sold and the money used to build state colleges. As American land-grant universities began training future senators and congressmen, the Eiffel Tower was built in Paris in 1889, 27 years after the Morrill Act, to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the French Revolution, and at the time, it was the tallest building in the world. The Eiffel Tower was designed by the same man who'd built the Statue of Liberty in 1886, and Eiffel was a German bridge builder whose family had moved to France and taken the name of the Eiffel Mountains from whence they had come, adding an extra F for France. The first person in France to have gotten guillotined, was named Peltier, or Peltier, to the Indians in America. And until Idaho became a state in 1890, it had simply been called the Columbia River Country. The French called the Snake River the Mad River, and the main town in Idaho was called Boise from the French Les Bois, that meant the trees, and Idaho was an Indian word that meant sunrise. The California and Oregon trails split at Fort Hall in Idaho, while the Mormon town where Idaho State University was built was named Pocatello, an Indian word that meant the road not followed, while the Europeans called Idaho the gateway to the Northwest. The Nazis used a new and improved scientific guillotine to get rid of undesirable people. And on the Adriatic Sea in Fiume, that was 40 miles away from the lovely port of Trieste, the French Rothschilds owned an oil refinery that was in a harbor deeply enough inland to make the journey to Fiume considerable enough by sea, so the Austrians had left the Nobel brothers and their Rothschild friends alone. The court at The Hague had been started over a dispute with Venezuela because they were ruining oil prices in 1903. There was a great Balkan crisis in 1908, followed by a sudden nasty squabble in 1912, in which all the small countries ganged up on the helpless remnant of the Ottoman Empire and swallowed its European portion. Italy, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, Romania, and Turkey were involved in this affair, which came and went with such callousness as to bring a twinge of fear to the great powers. Flanders Fields, page XXXIV to XXXV. America made 75,000 motorcycles in 1913, and Indian motorcycles were number one with their famous blood-red color, and Harleys were way behind, and two sisters who were the granddaughters of President Van Buren rode across America on Indian Chief motorcycles in 1916, wanting to get the government to let women be dispatch riders in the Great War. The two lady bikers rode up Pikes Peak and were the first people to get up there in any vehicle, and they did this after being arrested in several states for wearing men's clothing. During the Great War, Indian cashed in with Uncle Sam, not unlike how Krupp was prevailing in Germany, and Indians sold motorcycles only to the government, but as the war dragged on, Harley-Davidson stepped in to fill the consumer demand.